Men, women, and children donned similar homespun garments, practical and durable, with cloaks and simple shoes worn thin by years of hard use. The village's social structure was strictly hierarchical and land-centric. At the top stood the lord, who held ownership of the manor and lands, commanding authority over the inhabitants. His household and officials, reeves, bailiffs, and stewards, managed the estate's operations and ensured the lord's dues were collected. Knights and minor nobles served military and administrative roles, their status marked by land holdings and martial duties. The peasants were subdivided mainly into freemen and villeins. Freemen held or rented their own plots, allowing a degree of autonomy to trade or move, while villeins were serfs bound to the land, obliged to provide labor services to the lord, pay rents in crops or coin, and accept restrictions on marriage or mobility. Peasant life was labor-intensive and governed by the seasons. Spring was dedicated to plowing and sowing grains like barley, oats, and rye. Summer required painstaking weeding and crop tending, while autumn's arrival heralded a race to harvest before the cold winter set in. Fields were divided into narrow strips scattered across open fields, with communal cooperation essential to the success of agricultural tasks. Women played multiple indispensable roles, spinning thread, weaving cloth, cooking over smoky fires, laundering clothes by hand, milking cows, and tending to children and domestic duties. Meals were simple and frugal. Dense rye or barley bread, pottage made of grains and vegetables, and occasional additions of cheese, eggs, or dried meat. Meat was a rare luxury, mostly reserved for lords or special feast days. Food scarcity was frequent, especially at the end of winter, and grain reserves were tightly guarded. Religion infused daily life with structure and meaning. Sunday Mass and holy days offered respite from labor and a chance for communal gathering. The village priest stood as a central figure, spiritual guide, record keeper, and sometimes healer. The church also claimed a tenth of all produce as tithes, adding another layer of obligation. Despite the hardships, villagers found moments to celebrate and socialize. Folk dances, seasonal festivals, market days, and storytelling by firelight created bonds of shared culture and hope. These moments sustained the spirit and reinforced communal identity amidst a backdrop of ceaseless toil and vulnerability to the whims of nature, war, and disease. At the core of medieval rural life lay the feudal economic system, an intricate ancien regime where land was both the source of wealth and the marker of power. The manor served as the basic economic and administrative unit, encompassing the lord's demesne lands and the villages whose peasants cultivated them. Each manor was a largely self-sufficient estate, with its own farmland, pastures, forests, mills, and artisans, designed to provide for the needs of the lord, his household, and his dependents. The lord exercised control over all land, dividing it into two main parts. The demesne was land retained for the lord's direct use, worked either by his own men or by the peasants as part of their required labor services. The remaining land was parceled out in scattered strips among the peasants, known as villeins or serfs, who held these parcels conditionally on fulfilling obligations and paying rents. Peasants did not own the land outright. Rather, their tenure was often precarious and subject to the lord's whim, protected more by long custom than legal right. These strips were scattered across the open fields to prevent any family from monopolizing the best land.
Crop rotation and communal shared plowing created a patchwork of scattered holdings that required coordination between families. In exchange for the use of land, peasants owed a complex bundle of rents and labor. This included working lord's domain fields for multiple days a week without wages, delivering a share of their harvest, paying for use of the lord's facilities like mills and ovens, monopolies called banalities, and annual feudal dues on marriage, inheritance, or the transfer of holdings. Labor services demanded hard physical work: plowing, sowing, harvesting, repairing fences, and maintaining roads. The lord could call upon peasants to build or maintain castles, fortifications, and manor houses. This exploitation underpinned the wealth and status of the nobility.
Many peasants sought to supplement their livelihoods through additional labor as craftsmen, seasonal workers, or by renting additional land. They made tools, spun cloth, brewed ale, and tended animals. Though bound by obligation, their small-scale production and barter with nearby towns grew slowly, planting seeds of economic change that would eventually challenge the rigid feudal order. The manor's economy was largely natural. Surpluses were minimal. Most produce supported local needs rather than long-distance trade. Craftsmen within the manor produced essential goods. Blacksmiths forged tools and horseshoes, millers ground grain, carpenters built houses, and women spun wool and sewed garments. Luxury goods, salt, spices, fine cloth, came rarely through itinerant merchants. The economic dynamics created hardship and tension. Lords sought to maximize income, often imposing heavier burdens. Peasants responded with adaptations, resistance, and at times open rebellion. Yet the feudal system endured due to tradition, lack of alternatives, and the mutual dependencies woven through village life. As markets and towns slowly grew and money became more prevalent, some peasants gained opportunities to buy their freedom or improve their status. But for the majority, life remained a daily balancing act of survival within a system that limited personal freedom and prosperity. Despite the system's constraints, medieval peasants carved out lives rich with community, ritual, and resilience under the shadow of stones and plows, castles and crosses.
The social fabric of a medieval village was tightly woven and steeped in tradition, each person's role defined by birth, land ownership, and the demands of the manorial system. Although the lord stood at the apex of power, ruling over land and people from imposing manorial halls and castles, the village itself was a community of interdependent lives caught in the tides of feudalism. At the top of the social hierarchy was the lord of the manor, the landowner who wielded considerable authority. Responsibility for justice, auctioning debts, and collecting dues fell squarely on his shoulders or those of his appointed officers, the reeve, bailiff, and steward. These men ensured that peasants paid their rents, performed their labor obligations, and maintained village order, acting as intermediaries between the lord's interests and peasant realities. The lord's wealth derived from the labor of peasants who, although far from free, formed the backbone of rural economy. Among peasants, distinctions were stark. Freemen held more secure land tenure and certain legal rights, allowing some movement in trade, but still owing rents and services. Villeins, by contrast, were serfs, bound by law to the manor and its lord, their lives rooted in servitude. Their days were marked by exhausting toil, limited autonomy, and rigid restrictions on marriage and movement. Personal freedom was a distant dream. Outside the agricultural toil, artisans and skilled craftsmen held a special place. Blacksmiths, millers, cobblers, weavers, and brewers were essential to village life.
Though ranked below landowning farmers socially, their skills garnered respect. Craftsmen provided tools, processed grain, repaired shoes, wove cloth, and brewed ale, the lifeblood of peasant nutrition and celebration. Their roles balanced rural subsistence with emerging commercial exchange, linking village economies ever so slightly to wider markets.
The clergy formed a distinct and influential hierarchy, at times rivaling the nobility in power. The local priest was often the most educated person in a village, entrusted with spiritual guidance, record-keeping, education, and occasionally medicine. Bishops and abbots controlled extensive lands and wealth beyond the village boundaries, weaving religious influence into the social and economic fabric. Village households, simple structures of timber and wattle coated with mud, housed large families living in shared spaces with their animals. Smoke from the hearth filled rooms where men, women, and children labored side by side. Clothing was homemade from coarse wool or linen, with garments repaired countless times to stave off the chill. Work was relentless. Agricultural seasons dictated the pace, plowing and sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for the biting cold of winter. Crop yields determined not only immediate survival, but the ability to repay dues to lords, church tithes, and support families. Communal cooperation in tasks like plowing, haymaking, and threshing forged social bonds amidst hardship. Women's responsibilities extended into all corners of domestic and economic life, cooking over smoky fires, spinning thread, weaving cloth, caring for children, milking animals, and managing small gardens to supplement food supplies. Even the youngest children contributed, fetching water, gathering firewood, or herding animals. Peasant sustenance was humble. Coarse bread, watery pottage, occasional cheese, eggs, or salted fish comprised most meals. Rarely did meat grace their tables, reserved for lords or feast days. Malnutrition and illness were constant threats. Diet and hygiene were poor, contributing to short life expectancy. Social life revolved around the church calendar, with holy days, saints' festivals, and Sunday Mass marking time and providing respite from labor. In these moments, villagers gathered to celebrate, dance, share stories, and reaffirm communal ties. Despite overwhelming hardships, poverty, labor demands, disease, and limited freedoms, medieval villagers forged resilient communities. Their shared struggles, faith, and cooperation within the confines of feudal authority sustained life and identity through generations, their stories echoing faintly through the annals of history.
The social fabric of a medieval village was tightly woven and steeped in tradition, each person's role defined by birth, land ownership, and the demands of the manorial system. Although the lord stood at the apex of power, ruling over land and people from imposing manorial halls and castles, the village itself was a community of interdependent lives caught in the tides of feudalism. At the top of the social hierarchy was the lord of the manor, the landowner who wielded considerable authority. Responsibility for justice, auctioning debts, and collecting dues fell squarely on his shoulders, or those of his appointed officers, the reeve, bailiff, and steward. These men ensured that peasants paid their rents, performed their labor obligations, and maintained village order, acting as intermediaries between the lord's interests and peasant realities. The lord's wealth derived from the labor of peasants who, although far from free, formed the backbone of rural economy. Among peasants, distinctions were stark. Freemen held more secure land tenure and certain legal rights, allowing some movement in trade, but still owing rents and services. Villeins, by contrast, were serfs, bound by law to the manor and its lord, their lives rooted in servitude. Their days were marked by exhausting toil, limited autonomy,
and rigid restrictions on marriage and movement, personal freedom was a distant dream. Outside the agricultural toil, artisans and skilled craftsmen held a special place. Blacksmiths, millers, cobblers, weavers, and brewers were essential to village life. Though ranked below landowning farmers socially, their skills garnered respect. Craftsmen provided tools, processed grain, repaired shoes, wove cloth, and brewed ale, the lifeblood of peasant nutrition and celebration. Their roles balanced rural subsistence with emerging commercial exchange, linking village economies ever so slightly to wider markets. The clergy formed a distinct and influential hierarchy, at times rivaling the nobility in power. The local priest was often the most educated person in a village, entrusted with spiritual guidance, record-keeping, education, and occasionally medicine. Bishops and abbots controlled extensive lands and wealth beyond the village boundaries, weaving religious influence into the social and economic fabric. Village households, simple structures of timber.
Tonight's tale steps away from kings and knights cloaked in glory to reveal the shadowed world of a medieval peasant's life, a world of relentless hardship and quiet endurance. The story begins on a biting late November morning in a small village where a child named Thomas drew first breath among straw and smoke. In that village, calendars mattered little beyond planting seasons and saints' feast days. Thomas's mother gave birth near a flickering hearth, while his eldest sister fed the fire with dung to keep it alive. His father muttered resentfully about the burden that another mouth to feed would bring. The family's home was a simple timber hut, patched with wattle and daub, topped by a thatched roof that leaked with every hard rain. The floor was bare earth, swept only when absolutely necessary. Chickens roamed freely, uninvited and untamed, and a pig, warmer and less malagorous than most family members, often slept close to Thomas's cradle. Smoke curled thick and choking, filling the cramped space since no chimney vented the hearth's fire. It clung to clothing, hair, and skin, embedding itself deep into the bones, defining the very scent of life there. Milk was a scarce treasure, and childhood was not a time for play or schooling, but for work, fetching water from a possibly unclean stream, chasing stubborn chickens, and hauling baskets heavy with turnips. Lice and fleas were constant companions, and worms, when they appeared, were accepted as part of living. Life followed a relentless rhythm dictated by the seasons. Sow in spring, tend in summer, harvest in autumn, and pray not to freeze in winter. Yet even amid the hardship and hunger, moments of joy broke through. Secret visits to the cold stone chapel, rare feasts where bread was soft and ale flowed freely, and the stolen laughter of children chasing dreams as fleeting as the wind. But childhood faded rapidly. By 7 years old, Thomas was no longer a boy, but a willing helper, learning to shoulder the burdens of the fields and home. This is the life, scraped knees, blistered hands, and stubborn hope, that shaped him and countless others in that forgotten time. As the years passed, Thomas grew under the heavy weight of expectation. Simple joys were measured by the turn of the seasons, and every moment spent idle was a luxury long denied. By dawn, the village was already stirring, farmers tugging at yokes,
mothers scattering scraps to restless chickens, and children clutching worn wooden tools too large for their small hands. Fields stretched beyond the horizon, a patchwork of muddy earth and stubborn crops. Thomas learned early that fate often lay in the soil's mercy. A dry summer or a bitter frost could mean the difference between feast and famine. His small hands took up the scythe alongside his father, cutting swaths of rye and barley under a sun that beat unforgivingly. Life was punctuated by rustling leaves and the steady clank of wooden carts making their way across rutted paths. The village church, a stone sentinel, watched over each season's toil. Its bells called the weary to prayer and reminded all that even in suffering, hope was held by ancient faith. Often, Thomas found moments to steal away, wandering the edges of woodland, eyes sharp for birds or rabbits, mind briefly free from the grinding demands of work. At night, stories drifted through the smoky air, tales of old heroes mingling with whispered prayers for protection. Those were the times when the harshness of the day seemed distant and a fragile peace took hold.
But the unyielding reality remained. Frost could bite through ragged clothes and thin skin. Hunger gnawed sharply after long days in the field, and disease lurked unseen, snatching young and old alike. Yet through all hardships the village endured. Each day as Thomas and those around him faced the rising sun, life went on, a testament to resilience carved deep into the roots of the earth and the hearts of those who called it home.
Often Thomas found moments to steal away, wandering the edges of woodland, eyes sharp for birds or rabbits, mind briefly free from the grinding demands of work. At night, stories drifted through the smoky air, tales of old heroes mingling with whispered prayers for protection. Those were the times when the harshness of the day seemed distant and a fragile peace took hold. But the unyielding reality remained. Frost could bite through ragged clothes and thin skin. Hunger gnawed sharply after long days in the field, and disease lurked unseen, snatching young and old alike. Yet through all hardships, the village endured. Each day, as Thomas and those around him faced the rising sun, life went on, a testament to resilience carved deep into the roots of the earth and the hearts of those who called it home. Days began before dawn as the village slowly came to life. The villagers rose from hard straw-stuffed beds to face another relentless cycle dictated by the seasons. Tasks were assigned by the reeve, the Lord's appointed overseer, who kept a sharp watch over the fields and laborers. From sunup to sundown, the peasantry labored in the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, their efforts barely enough to secure the next meal. The earth, stubborn and uneven, yielded crops like rye, oats, peas, and barley, harvested carefully with sickles and scythes that grew dull with wear. Women's work was no less grueling, milking cows and goats, tending chickens, cooking over smoky fires, washing clothes by hand, spinning wool into thread, and managing the household's daily needs. Children, too, contributed from an early age, fetching water from the commune well, tending animals, gathering firewood. Mere seconds of leisure were rare and precious. Religious observance played a powerful role in daily life. Sundays and saint days brought brief respite, sacred pauses when labor was forbidden. Yet even rest bore a price, for demands from the church included tithes, 10% of harvests,
adding strain to already stretched resources. Disease lurked unseen, hygiene was poor, and food shortages common, especially in early spring when last season's stores ran thin before new crops ripened. Through it all, survival depended on resilience, solidarity, and a steady faith in the ancient rhythms of land and life. The medieval village existed within a rigid social hierarchy where land ownership dictated power and status. At the very top stood the lord, the landowner, who claimed dominion over the territory and all who worked it. Beneath him were a few local officials, reeves, stewards, and bailiffs, tasked with enforcing the lord's will, collecting taxes, and overseeing justice. Most villagers were peasants, themselves divided into classes by rights and obligations. Some were freemen, possessing small plots of land and a degree of independence, able to trade or set up small businesses free from direct control of the lord.
Below these were the villeins or serfs, peasants bound to the lord's land, tied by duty and circumstance. They worked the manor's fields, tending crops and livestock in exchange for a small parcel of land on which to support their families. Their lives were hard and restricted. They could not leave without permission and paid rents and dues chiefly in labor. At the very bottom were slaves, though few in number, held as property with no rights and subjected to the harshest treatment. Despite their lowly status, peasants were the backbone of the village. Their labor fueled the feudal economy. Their days began with the rising sun and ended only when the work was done, amid the ever-present demands of lord and church. Yet within the village community, peasants found places of respect and significance. Artisans like blacksmiths and millers provided essential skills, while the village priest held both spiritual and administrative authority. This complex yet delicate system shaped every aspect of life, from birth to death, binding countless individuals into a shared struggle beneath the weight of class and obligation. Village life revolved around the endless demands of agriculture. Each dawn brought the same rituals, fanning embers into flames to warm the clay hearth, drawing water from the communal well, and setting out to tend the scattered strips of land assigned to each family. The peasant's house was humble, a single room with earthen floors and walls made from timber and wattle, patched with daub. Smoke from the hearth swirled through the dwelling, filling the air with a sooty haze that settled into blankets, clothes, and hair. Animals shared the cramped space, hens nested in the corners, and a pig often sought the warmth radiating from the family. Work never truly ended. Fields demanded plowing, sowing, and harvesting, all with simple tools like wooden plows pulled by oxen and scythes sharpened not often enough. Crops such as rye, barley, oats, and peas were staples, their success determining whether the coming winter held enough food. Women's role stretched beyond the fields. They spun wool into thread, sanitized linens with boiling water, prepared sparse meals over smoky fires, and cared for the children and the household. Even the youngest children participated, helping fetch firewood or tend small animals. The village calendar was marked by feast days and religious observances, brief pauses in labor when prayers echoed through the stone church. These days brought communal breaks, occasional celebrations, and a rekindling of the fragile spirit beneath the burden of survival. At its core, medieval village life was a delicate balance between toil and rest, scarcity and fleeting abundance.
hardship endured through a steady rhythm born of centuries. At the heart of medieval village life was the feudal system, a complex web of obligations and dependencies binding lord and peasant. Land was both power and currency. The lord owned vast estates, split into two parts: the domain, lands reserved for the lord's direct control, and the strips, farmed by peasants as tenants. Peasants owed labor, produce, and various payments to the lord in exchange for the right to work small parcels of land. More than simple rent, these dues included fixed days of labor on the lord's domain, fees for grinding grain at the lord's mill, and tithes to the church. The economy was largely a natural one, almost self-contained. Villages produced much of what they consumed. Local craftsmen, blacksmiths, millers, weavers supplied daily necessities, though their skills were constrained by limited resources and rudimentary tools. Markets and trade existed, but were often infrequent and modest, with peasants bartering goods or selling surplus at nearby towns when possible. Increasingly, coin currency began to enter village life, gradually altering economic relationships and revealing new vulnerabilities. Beyond the fields, peasants sometimes labored as craftsmen or in service to the manor, erecting buildings, repairing roads, or tending livestock. This economic system provided little room for prosperity. Survival required unyielding toil, resourcefulness, and acceptance of a life constrained by rigid social and economic order. Yet amid this, communities forged bonds of cooperation and mutual reliance that sustained them through the cycles of hardship and hope. At the heart of medieval village life was the feudal system, a complex web of obligations and dependencies binding lord and peasant. Land was both power and currency. The lord owned vast estates, split into two parts: the domain, lands reserved for the lord's direct control, and the strips, farmed by peasants as tenants. Peasants owed labor, produce, and various payments to the lord in exchange for the right to work small parcels of land. More than simple rent, these dues included fixed days of labor on the lord's domain, fees for grinding grain at the lord's mill, and tithes to the church. The economy was largely a natural one, almost self-contained. Villages produced much of what they consumed. Local craftsmen, blacksmiths, millers, weavers supplied daily necessities, though their skills were constrained by limited resources and rudimentary tools. Markets and trade existed, but were often infrequent and modest, with peasants bartering goods or selling surplus at nearby towns when possible. Increasingly, coin currency began to enter village life, gradually altering economic relationships and revealing new vulnerabilities. Beyond the fields, peasants sometimes labored as craftsmen or in service to the manor, erecting buildings, repairing roads, or tending livestock. This economic system provided little room for prosperity. Survival required unyielding toil, resourcefulness, and acceptance of a life constrained by rigid social and economic order. Yet amid this, communities forged bonds of cooperation and mutual reliance that sustained them through the cycles of hardship and hope.
The village social structure mirrored the wider feudal system, clearly defined by land ownership and social status. At the top of this hierarchy stood the lord, the landowner who commanded authority over the manor and all its inhabitants. Below him were officials such as the reeve, steward, and bailiff, who managed day-to-day affairs, enforced rules, and collected dues owed to the lord. Artisans, blacksmiths, millers, bakers, and weavers held important but middling positions in village life.
These skilled workers provided essential goods and services, supporting both peasants and nobility. Though their social rank was modest, their craft granted them a degree of respect and influence. The peasants themselves were divided mainly into freemen and villeins. Freemen had some rights, could move about, and owned or rented land, while villeins, serfs in all but name, were bound to a particular piece of land and owed labor and dues to their lord. They had limited freedom and faced many obligations, but formed the bulk of the village population. At the bottom were servants and laborers with the fewest privileges, often dwelling alongside animals in cramped conditions. Despite their low status, these villagers were vital threads in the fabric of rural life, maintaining the manor's farms, buildings, and households. The church formed a distinct but deeply intertwined hierarchy, with the village priest wielding spiritual and administrative authority, often serving as the only literate person in the community. Monks and clergy managed vast tracts of land and wielded influence rivaling that of nobles. This layered social order shaped every aspect of village life, from daily work to justice, from celebrations to sorrow, binding the community tightly to a cycle of duty, faith, and survival. Life in a medieval village was marked by an unyielding rhythm, tied to the cycle of the seasons and the demands of the land. The vast majority of the population were peasants, farmers who tilled the soil, raised livestock, and performed a multitude of duties needed to sustain themselves and fulfill their obligations to the Lord.
The village social structure mirrored the wider feudal system, clearly defined by land ownership and social status. At the top of this hierarchy stood the lord, the landowner who commanded authority over the manor and all its inhabitants. Below him were officials such as the reeve, steward, and bailiff, who managed day-to-day affairs, enforced rules, and collected dues owed to the lord. Artisans, blacksmiths, millers, bakers, and weavers held important but middling positions in village life. These skilled workers provided essential goods and services, supporting both peasants and nobility. Though their social rank was modest, their craft granted them a degree of respect and influence. The peasants themselves were divided mainly into freemen and villeins. Freemen had some rights, could move about, and owned or rented land, while villeins, serfs in all but name, were bound to a particular piece of land and owed labor and dues to their lord. They had limited freedom and faced many obligations, but formed the bulk of the village population. At the bottom were servants and laborers with the fewest privileges, often dwelling alongside animals in cramped conditions. Despite their low status, these villagers were vital threads in the fabric of rural life, maintaining the manor's farms, buildings, and households. The church formed a distinct but deeply intertwined hierarchy, with the village priest wielding spiritual and administrative authority, often serving as the only literate person in the community. Monks and clergy managed vast tracts of land and wielded influence rivaling that of nobles. This layered social order shaped every aspect of village life, from daily work to justice, from celebrations to sorrow, binding the community tightly to a cycle of duty, faith, and survival. Life in a medieval village was marked by an unyielding rhythm tied to the cycle of the seasons and the demands of the land. The vast majority of the population were peasants, farmers who tilled the soil, raised livestock, and performed a multitude of duties needed to sustain themselves and fulfill their obligations to the Lord.
Daily life began at dawn, often before the sun had risen. Fire was coaxed to life in the hearth using dried dung or wood. filling the single-room hut with smoke and warmth. The floor was bare earth, compacted by countless footsteps and swept only occasionally. Light came mostly from the open doorway or a small window, if any, leaving much of the hut dim and smoky. Inside, the family shared their cramped space with animals. Hens roosted in corners, a pig found shelter where it could, adding warmth but also odor to the humble dwelling. The peasants' attire reflected their poverty. Homespun wool and linen, patched repeatedly to extend the life of worn garments. Men and women alike wore simple tunics, cloaks, and sturdy shoes, often with makeshift repairs. Head coverings, such as simple wraps or caps, were common, serving both practical and social signaling purposes. Work was laborious and unending. The agricultural calendar dictated the village's pulse. Spring was for plowing and sowing seeds of rye, oats, barley, and legumes. Summer demanded constant tending, hoe-weeding, guarding against pests, and hoping for rain. Autumn was for frantic harvesting and preparing for winter's scarcity. Fields were divided into strips, scattered across communal open fields. Each family was allocated multiple strips to share both good and poor quality land. Cooperation was essential. Villagers worked together on heavy tasks such as plowing, haymaking, and building fences. Women's roles extended beyond the fields. They spun wool using basic wheels, made and mended clothes by hand, prepared meals over smoky fires, milked cows or goats, tended children, and kept household order. Almost no aspect of daily life was without effort. Even children contributed, fetching water from communal wells, gathering firewood, tending flocks, and helping with domestic chores. Education for most was oral and practical, telling stories, prayers, and lessons in farming handed down through generations. Meals were simple and repetitive: coarse bread, pottage made from grains or vegetables, the occasional egg or cheese when provisions allowed. Meat was rare, a luxury meant mostly for the Lord's table or special feast days. Religion permeated village life. Sundays and saints' days were marked by church attendance, prayers, and rest from labor. The village priest was a key figure, providing spiritual guidance and performing important rites. Apart from the hard labor, villagers found fleeting moments for social life, folk festivals, dances, occasional trading at nearby markets, and storytelling around the hearth. These moments offered respite and forged communal bonds that were vital for survival. Despite the hardships, these villages endured in the face of harsh winters, poor harvests, and disease. Their persistent cycle of work, faith, and community held the fabric of medieval rural life together, weaving a tapestry of resilience that defined the era. The medieval village was a small, tightly knit community where life revolved around the unyielding rhythms of the land and the social bonds woven by necessity and tradition. Homes were simple, often little more than single-room huts with thatched roofs, timber frames, and floors of packed earth. Within these confined spaces, families lived alongside their animals, hens nesting in the corners, and pigs seeking warmth near the hearth. The air was thick with smoke from fires burning endlessly for heat and cooking, a haze that clung to every surface, impregnating clothes, hair, and skin.
Clothing reflected limited means, rough-spun wool and linen patched repeatedly to stave off cold and wear.
Of timber and wattle coated with mud housed large families living in shared spaces with their animals. Smoke from the hearth filled rooms where men, women, and children labored side by side. Clothing was homemade from coarse wool or linen, with garments repaired countless times to stave off the chill. Work was relentless. Agricultural seasons dictated the pace. Plowing and sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for the biting cold of winter. Crop yields determined not only immediate survival, but the ability to repay dues to lords, church tithes, and support families. Communal cooperation in tasks like plowing, haymaking, and threshing forged social bonds amidst hardship. Women's responsibilities extended into all corners of domestic and economic life, cooking over smoky fires, spinning thread, weaving cloth, caring for children, milking animals, and managing small gardens to supplement food supplies. Even the youngest children contributed, fetching water, gathering firewood, or herding animals. Peasant sustenance was humble. Coarse bread, watery pottage, occasional cheese, eggs, or salted fish comprised most meals. Rarely did meat grace their tables, reserved for lords or feast days. Malnutrition and illness were constant threats. Diet and hygiene were poor, contributing to short life expectancy. Social life revolved around the church calendar, with holy days, saints' festivals, and Sunday Mass marking time and providing respite from labor. In these moments, villagers gathered to celebrate, dance, share stories, and reaffirm communal ties. Despite overwhelming hardships, poverty, labor demands, disease, and limited freedoms, medieval villagers forged resilient communities. Their shared struggles, faith, and cooperation within the confines of feudal authority sustained life and identity through generations, their stories echoing faintly through the annals of history.
Morning light crept slowly into the smoky huts where medieval villagers awoke to a world defined by labor and survival. The first task was often coaxing fire embers to flame, warming the hearth that was the household's heart and hearth's smoke the ever-present companion. Thick soot hung in the air. Smoke curled lazily toward crude openings in the thatched roof, the only ventilation in the cramped, dimly lit space. Homes were modest in size and furnishings. A single main room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with rough benches or stools, a few wooden chests for storage, and bedding folded within straw-stuffed sacks. The floor of packed earth gave off a cool dampness, needing constant sweeping, especially when animals shared the living space. Chickens clucked and pecked among scattered grains, while a pig often found its familiar corner for warmth and scraps. Clothing reflected the austere conditions. Homespun wool and linen dyed with natural pigments faded to muted browns, grays, and dull greens. Garments were patched and layered, worn to threadbare over years of mending. Men and women donned loose tunics, often secured with simple leather belts from which small knives and tools hung. Head coverings varied, but often consisted of simple cloth wraps or coifs, serving both practical protection from weather and subtle social cues. The rhythm of the day was dictated by the agrarian calendar. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer demanded constant crop tending and pest control. Autumn was a race against frost to harvest, and winter forced a retreat indoors, where the cold was battled by sparse fires and thick clothing.
Work was communal and unyielding. Families labored on strips of open fields with scattered neighbors, cooperating to ensure every row was plowed, every tuft of grain cut and bundled. Heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen tore furrows in stubborn soil, while sickles and scythes, sharp but often ill-maintained, gathered the precious harvest. Haymaking and threshing were collective endeavors that sewed social bonds, even amid exhaustion. Women's work was ceaseless and multidimensional, spinning raw wool into coarse thread, weaving cloth on simple looms, cooking over smoky hearths using basic iron or clay pots, washing linens by hand in cold water, tending to small vegetable gardens, milking goats and cows, raising children, and mending clothes and tools. Childhood was short and purposeful. From early years, children fetched water, gathered firewood, tended poultry, and learned farming tasks through imitation and instruction. Meals were modest, mostly rye or barley bread, watery vegetable stews thickened with grains or legumes, occasional eggs or cheese, and rarely fish or preserved meats. The rhythms of hunger tracked the seasons, with winter surviving on stored root vegetables and dried grains. Malnutrition was a constant threat, and huts were often cold and damp. Religion permeated daily existence. Sundays and feast days were sacrosanct pauses, marked by long masses, prayers, and communal meals. The village church was the spiritual and social heart, where rites of birth, marriage, and death underscored vulnerability and continuity. Despite the relentless hardships, villagers found moments of joy. Dances around village greens, storytelling by firelight, sharing songs and laughter after long days. These simple pleasures knit a shared identity and resilience that allowed the village to endure through the centuries. This detailed passage paints a vivid sensory and social picture of medieval village life, continuing the immersive narrative.
The village lay nestled in the folds of the rolling countryside, a scattering of low thatched roofs clustered around a well-worn dirt lane. At its heart stood the modest church, its stone walls worn by centuries of wind and rain, the lone sentinel of faith and governance. This was the realm of the medieval peasant, who, though bound by land and lord to a harsh existence, shaped the very lifeblood of a feudal age. Homes were humble, constructed from timber frames, filled with a lattice of woven branches and mud plaster, topped with coarse thatch that leaked under heavy rains. Inside, the single-room houses bore scant furnishings, rough-hewn benches, a hearth pit for cooking and warmth, and hanging bundles of dried herbs and flax. The smells of smoke, livestock, sweat, and earth mingled in an ever-present haze. Families shared their space with animals, the clucking of chickens, the grunting of pigs, the restless shifting of goats, whose presence warmed the coldest corners at night, but also whispered of hardship and grime. Daily life was a palette of toil, ritual, and survival. The peasant's day began before dawn. Men, women, and children rose from rough straw pallets to stoke the hearth's embers, readying pots of gruel or boiled roots for the meager morning meal. Tools were gathered, wooden yokes, scythes with iron blades dulled by use, baskets woven from rushes, and off they went to scattered strips in the open fields. The fields themselves were a patchwork quilt of narrow strips owned jointly as open fields, laid out in rotation to maintain soil fertility. Life in these fields was a lesson in community dependency, where every hand mattered and every row counted. The village plow, clumsy and heavy, was pulled by oxen along furrows turned under the watchful eyes of peasants who knew each stone and ditch from repeated steps. Seasons marked unyielding chores. Spring brought the hope and hardship of plowing and broadcasting grain. Summer was a constant battle against weeds, pests, and the unpredictable weather, each day an exercise in vigilance. Autumn held the frantic energy of harvest, the air filled with the rustle of grain cut by scythe and sickle, the rhythmic beating of flails during threshing,
and the dusty sweat of muscle and sunburned skin. Winter brought restlessness, cold, and the grinding scarcity of stored food, a test of endurance and thrift. Women's contributions were no less vital. They spun wool by hand to weave clothing and blankets, tended gardens to supplement diets with onions, peas, and cabbage, and kept the heart of the home pulsing amid hardship. Cooking was a ritual performed over smoky fires, coarse bread baked in communal ovens, stews thickened with grains and wild herbs, preserved meats savored on rare feast days. They tended babies swaddled in rags, soothed feverish children with herbal potions, and balanced household accounts while maintaining the rhythms of daily labor. Children, brief as their childhood was, learned early. From toddling days they chased chickens, gathered kindling, and fetched water from the well, their laughter a fragile counterpoint to the weight of expectation pressing on their small shoulders. Lessons came through observation and participation: how to wield a sickle, the telltale signs of blight on barley, the changing winds of weather. The social order was strictly enforced, rooted in the feudal system that governed land and life. At the summit was the Lord, a figure both distant and ever-present, his wealth derived from the sweat of serfs and freemen laboring under his claim. His manor was the seat of authority, where disputes were settled, taxes exacted, and justice meted. Below the Lord, local officials, the reeve, the bailiff, the steward, managed the day-to-day machinery of manorial governance. They enforced labor laws, oversaw harvest quotas, and ensured that the village met its obligations. Their presence was a reminder that freedom was limited and power unbalanced.
Artisans and tradesmen held a vital but complex place in this system. The blacksmith forged the tools and horseshoes that kept plows churning and carts rolling. The miller ground grain into flour for the Lord's household and villagers alike, his monopoly granting him influence and occasional resentment. Weavers, brewers, carpenters, and tanners each plied their crafts, sustaining life's essentials beyond the furrows. However, it was the peasants, the freemen and villains, who formed the village's backbone. Freemen enjoyed marginally more rights and could theoretically move or trade their land rights, while villains were legally tied to their holdings, beholden to the Lord's commands, laboring for him without pay, but in exchange for protection and subsistence. Servants formed another lower class, a domestic labor force completing the manorial economy. Their lives were an endless cycle of labor, rendered harder by feudal dues that claimed a tenth or more of their produce, church tithes, and meals often stretched thin. Yet within these limitations, peasants cultivated hope and kinship. Villages were places of shared toil and shared fortune, the weaving of social ties that allowed communities to weather hardship and occasional bounty. Religion was a constant, threading solace and structure through village life. The church was the hub of spiritual life and community gatherings. Sunday Mass, Saints' Days, festivals like Christmas and Easter brought brief respite and celebration. The parish priest was a central figure, often the only literate villager, keeper of records, teacher, advisor, and faith's guardian. Amid hardship, life unfolded in small, profoundly human moments: the birth of a child, the soft glow of candlelight during prayer, hands clasped in the fields, the warm laughter shared among neighbors over a jug of ale. Disease and death shadowed the village. Sickness was common and cure rudimentary. A fever could claim the strongest laborer or the newest infant. The churchyard's small crosses marked lives gone too soon, a reminder that life was a fleeting gift amid toil. Yet through the rust and mud, stones and straw, the village pulsed with resilience.
Life was hard, but it was lived fully. In each planted seed, each shared meal, each whispered prayer, and each sunrise promising the next day. The land of the manor was divided into two main parts. The domain comprised fields working directly for the Lord's benefit. These were hallmarked by the regular presence of the Lord's officials and required labor from peasants as a form of rent. The rest consisted of scattered strips farmed by peasants for their own sustenance, under the obligation to provide dues and labor to the Lord. For most peasants, their tenure was precarious. They were villeins or serfs, legally bound to the estate and beholden to the Lord's demands. Their rights were limited, though often protected by village customs and manorial courts that regulated access to land and labor obligations. Movement was restricted, and permission was required for marriage, transfer of land, or to seek work beyond the manor. Peasants' labor was the cornerstone of the feudal economy. Work was unpaid but compulsory, lasting for a set number of days plowing, sowing, harvesting, and maintaining manorial infrastructure. The lord reaped a hefty portion of the crops and profits, while peasants eked out a survival living from the remainder. Besides the fields, villages had blacksmiths, millers, carpenters, and other craftsmen essential to life, whose skills kept the manor functioning. Some peasants supplemented their livelihood through crafts, small trading, or seasonal work. The manorial economy was essentially natural, mostly self-contained, and oriented around subsistence. Surplus generated was extracted by the lord and church through rents, taxes, and tithes. Market opportunities were sparse, but slow growth of market towns and currency started to change traditional relationships. Village life unfolded within this framework of feudal obligations balanced by social customs and communal cooperation. Houses were dark and smoky, fires burning tirelessly to ward off chill with smoky embers filling the confined space. Clothes were patched repeatedly. Tools were simple but indispensable. The villagers gathered water from a common well, carried firewood long distances, and shared tasks to maintain fences, roads, and fields. The open field system required a delicate balance of cooperation and order, lest disputes arise over turnip patches or grazing rights. Religious observance was integral, guiding the passage of the year through saints' days and holy festivals. The village church, though modest, anchored community life, services, rites of passage, and the punishment of moral offenses, all reinforcing a common identity. Despite hardships, the village thrummed with life and resilience. Songs echoed during harvest dances. Stories of saints and heroes were shared around smoky fires. Friendships and kinship linked families from birth to death. It was a world of endurance and faith, harsh yet filled with moments of unexpected warmth and joy. This reality was the backbone of medieval England, the unseen canvas upon which history's grand narratives rarely pause to look.
In the medieval village, life was a constant balancing act between endurance and hope, shaped by the rhythms of nature, the seasons, social obligations, and communal ties. Most villagers were peasants, farmers who labored from dawn till dusk to coax a living from the stubborn earth, to feed families and fulfill manorial dues that defined their existence. Homes were simple and pragmatic. Timber frames filled with woven branches and coated with mud formed rough walls. Roofs of straw or reeds leaked in the frequent rains of England's northern climate. Inside these single-room huts, families lived crowded among animals. Hens roosted near the fire. Pigs found warmth beside beds of straw. The air was smoky, thick with the sharp scent of burning dung or wood, filling lungs and clinging to skin and hair. Floors of beaten earth were swept but never truly clean. Furniture was sparse, rough benches, wooden chests, storing ragged clothing and bedding, rudimentary cooking pots and ladles. Beds were filled with straw, coarse ticks that offered little comfort, often infested with insects. Light came mostly from open doors or small shuttered windows without glass, leaving interiors dim and chilly. Clothing was thick but coarse, homespun wool for outerwear, flax linen for undergarments. Garments were dyed with natural substances, faded to dull shades of ochre, gray, and brown. Wool yarn was spun by women and children, woven on simple looms to make the coarse cloth that clothed the village. Shoes were heavy leather, often repaired with patches of scraps. Daily existence was governed by agriculture's cycle. Spring meant plowing the compact soil with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowing seed barley and rye. Summer demanded oh-so-patient tending, hoeing weeds, guarding fragile crops against ravaging birds and locusts, hoping against hope for enough rain. Autumn was the frantic crescendo, the scythe swinging, stalks bending, grain bundled and stored in cribs to last the harsh winter.
The arable land was divided into long, narrow strips, distributed to several families according to custom and manorial decree. This open field system required coordination, as the community tilled as one and shared rotation of fields to preserve soil fertility. Each peasant's livelihood depended on these scattered parcels and the collective efforts of neighbors. Women were the backbone of the household economy. They brewed ale, spun flax, wove cloth, cooked hearty stews over smoky hearths, tended goats and animals, cleaned and cared for children. Their days were filled with endless chores, their lives woven tightly into family and community survival. From early childhood, children were apprentices to village life. They fetched water from wells or streams, gathered firewood from nearby woods, tended poultry and animals, and learned farming through observation, imitation, and repetition. Play was scarce, replaced by duty, but brief moments of laughter and mischief found refuge among the humblest moments. Village diet was simple but monotonous. Thick rye bread, pottage, a gruel or stew of grains, root vegetables, and wild greens, with occasional cheese or eggs supplements. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for the Lord's table or festival days. Hunger hovered at the edges of life, especially during the late winter and early spring when stored food ran low.
Religion enclosed the village in a spiritual embrace. The droning of Sunday Mass, the ringing of bells calling villagers to prayer, marked the sacredness of time. Saints' days and church festivals punctuated the calendar, breaking the monotony of toil with celebration, gathering, and hope. The parish priest, often the village's only literate person, was a vital figure, keeper of records, dispenser of sacraments, and moral guide. The social hierarchy was rigid. Lords ruled from their manor courts and castles, exacting labor, produce, and taxes from serfs and freemen alike. The manorial officials, reeve, steward, bailiff, enforced order, collected dues, and managed daily affairs. Peasantry was divided between freemen, who had a degree of independence, and villeins or serfs bound to the land. Servants and laborers occupied the bottom tier, but contributed all the same to the manor's life. Despite hardships, the village held rich traditions and communal bonds. Celebrations, Harvest festivals, weddings, religious feasts were moments of joy and solidarity. Songs and stories passed by word of mouth kept histories alive. Neighbors supported one another in sickness, loss, and the slow grind of seasons. This gray world of mud, straw, and toil etched a life of endurance, faith, and fleeting joys, an unvarnished testament to survival on the margins of history.
Among the moments that brought light and joy to the otherwise labor-intensive and harsh rhythms of medieval village life were the festivals and ceremonies centered on seasonal changes, religious celebrations, and local traditions. These gatherings provided vital breaks from toil, reinforcing community bonds, shared identities, and faith through joyous celebration, ritual, and spectacle. The medieval calendar brimmed with festivals aligned with the agricultural cycle and Christian holy days. Each event embodied the fusion of ancient customs and imposed religious orthodoxy, an intricate dance of reverence, merriment, and survival. One of the earliest celebrations was Candlemas in February, marking the midpoint of winter and skirting the hope of returning light. Villagers held candlelit processions symbolizing purity and the illumination of the soul, kindling resilience against the encroaching cold. Come spring, exuberant festivals like Ostara heralded fertility and rebirth. Though the Church often absorbed or reinterpreted these seasonal rites, traces of their pagan origins lingered in symbols such as eggs and rabbits, evoking nature's renewal. May Day, celebrated on the 1st of May, was a highlight of village social life. It featured lively maypole dances with ribbons twirling high, crowning of the May Queen, a symbol of blossoming youth and fertility, and games that brought the whole village together in bursts of laughter and dance.
Midsummer, coinciding with the feast of St. John the Baptist, dazzled with bonfires whose flames lashed into night skies. The fires symbolized the brightness of St. John's soul and were imbued with old beliefs of protection against misfortune and malevolent spirits. Villagers danced around these flames, carrying torches in lively processions, and engaged in playful ritual traditions such as rolling wheels of fire down hillsides, hoping to scorch away pests and diseases. Harvest festivals, like Lammas Day on August 2nd, emphasized thanksgiving for the bounty of grain before the arrival of harsh frosts. Homes and churches were decorated with sheaths of wheat, and candlelit processions threaded through fields and lanes. These celebrations rippled through communal life, reminding all of shared dependency on the land's generosity and the necessity of cooperation. Michaelmas, marked on September 29, closed the harvest season. It was a time for feasting on goose or chicken, settling rents, and preparing for winter scarcity. Alongside this came All Souls' Day, a somber occasion where communities lit bonfires and held vigils to remember and pray for departed loved ones, reinforcing social ties across the boundary of life and death. Religious festivals supplied rich entertainment. Miracle plays dramatized biblical tales, morality lessons, and saints' lives, performed by villagers themselves with simple costumes and impromptu stages. These plays made abstract theology tangible and communal memory vivid, blurring lines between sacred ritual and folk theatre. Morris dancing energized villagers with lively folk performances, dancers adorned in bells and ribbons, brandishing sticks or swords,
weaving intricate patterns to the pulse of fiddles and drums. These dances were believed to bring good luck, drive away evil spirits, and ensure fertile crops. Knights' tournaments and jousts, though primarily noble spectacles, occasionally spilled into village life during festivals hosted by lords seeking to display power and prestige. Villagers would gather to watch the clatter of armored riders and cheer the demonstrations of martial skill, feeding the aspiration and myth-making that inspired even the poorest spectators. Market fairs often coincided with festivals, transforming villages into bustling hubs of trade and socializing. Merchants hawked cloth, salt, spices, and trinkets. Artisans showcased finely crafted wares. Children followed their parents through rows of stalls, wide-eyed at the colorful displays and lively barter. Among more boisterous customs were communal gatherings with prescribed roles. During Hocktide, men and women engaged in playful abductions and ransoms, blurring social boundaries in ritualized games that combined courtship and charity. Despite later attempts by authorities to suppress what they deemed licentious or disorderly, village traditions endured through centuries, their festive magic lighting the dark and grinding landscape of medieval peasant life. Through laughter and song, dance and feast, the cycle of life was affirmed and celebrated, infusing the ordinary with moments of grace, defiance, and connection.
Marriage in the medieval village was a complex social institution steeped in tradition, law, and ritual, far removed from modern notions of romantic union. Though the ideals of love and partnership played a role, the primary purpose of marriage in this era was the formation of alliances between families, the securing of land and property, and the continuation of lineage. For peasants, wedding customs reflected economic realities, social hierarchy, communal involvement, and religious sanction. Unlike the grand ceremonies of the nobility, peasant marriages were often modest affairs, marked by communal celebration rather than lavish display. The legal and religious frameworks governing marriage, however, were uniform across social classes, binding all couples within the same spiritual and social order. Formal religious ceremonies at churches became widespread after mandates from the church in the 12th and 13th centuries required marriages to be publicly solemnized and witnessed by a priest. Before this, marriages might have been contracted privately or informally, with mutual consent and consummation serving as binding. Weddings were frequently announced publicly through the reading of banns on Sunday Mass on 3 consecutive weeks. This practice ensured that any objections could be raised, such as prohibited degrees of kinship, prior commitments, or vows of celibacy, avoiding clandestine or invalid unions. The bride's family bore the responsibility of assembling a dowry, providing gifts of household utensils, clothing, sometimes livestock or land, which would support the new couple's household. The groom, in turn, often provided a wedding gift, symbolically illustrating his capacity for provision and his willingness to protect and cherish his bride.
Ceremonies typically took place at the church doors, where the priest would confirm the couple's consent and the absence of impediments. Vows were exchanged publicly, and rings, usually worn by the bride alone on the right hand, were presented as symbols of commitment and ownership. The ritual concluded with the blessing of the union, prayers, and often a mass conducted under a cloth canopy symbolizing sanctity and shared destiny. The kiss of peace followed, joining bride and groom in the eyes of God and community. Social customs surrounding marriage extended beyond the church walls. The community's role was integral. Neighbors participated in preparations, feasting, and festivities. The wedding feast was an occasion for socializing, dancing, music, and reaffirmation of communal bonds. Food was simple but hearty: bread, cheese, ale, and roasted meats if available, shared among villagers who might gather for days. A striking and somewhat surprising custom was the bedding ceremony, wherein the newlyweds were escorted to their marital bed by witnesses from both families. This practice aimed to ensure the marriage's consummation, deemed essential for its legal and spiritual validity. The presence of witnesses alleviated doubts about the union and affirmed social and familial approval. Marriage age varied, with aristocrats often wed in their early teens for political and economic pact reasons, while peasants typically married later, often in their 20s, due to financial constraints and the necessity of establishing an independent household.
The transition from childhood to adult responsibilities was often marked by marriage. For women especially, the ceremony signified a profound change, leaving her parental home, entering her husband's household, and assuming new roles as wife, mother, and worker within the rural economy. Despite the sometimes bleak realities of arranged unions and limited personal choice, marriage was also a source of companionship, social stability, and continuity. Couples forged family ties, weathered hardships, and celebrated life's milestones together, weaving their lives into the enduring fabric of village history. These customs, rituals, and communal activities ensured that marriage was not solely a private affair, but an event suffused with collective significance, religious solemnity, social order, and human hopes for prosperity and posterity. The medieval village thrived and endured largely due to the constant rhythms of daily life, where work and community intertwined beneath the vast skies and ever-changing seasons. Amidst the patchwork of farms, simple homes, and winding paths, peasants faced each day steeped in the agrarian calendar that shaped their physical, social, and spiritual existence. Dawn arrived softly in the little village, spreading muted light through the smoky interior of thatched huts. The first task was to coax a sputtering fire into life from the dying embers saved overnight. The thick smoke filled the single-room homes, rising slowly to escape through the small hole in the thatched roof. The ground below was hard-packed earth, periodically swept and never truly clean, softened only by scattered rushes or straw.
Families stirred in cramped quarters where room shared space with livestock. Chickens roosted in corners. Pigs curled close to lend warmth through frosty nights. The air was thick, not just with smoke, but with the mingling odors of animals, damp soil, and cooking fires. Life's fabric was woven of simple necessities stretched thin. Homes were sparsely furnished: rough stools, a wooden chest or two for bedding, a clearing near the hearth for cooking pots and food preparation. There were no glass windows, only wooden shutters or lattices that let in light and rain. Clothes were hand-spun wool and homespun linen, heavy, coarse, and repeatedly patched over worn areas. Boots or shoes were leather, sturdy but weather-worn. By first light, villagers dressed in their muted garb and stepped into a world whose pace was measured in plantings, harvests, and animal cycles. Morning meals were small, often plain porridge or bread softened with water or ale. There was no luxury beyond what the land and craft could provide. Fields spread outward from the village in long strips.
These open fields were the peasants' lifeblood and source of endless labor. Here, the community labored together to plow the soil with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowed seeds of rye and barley, tended crops against blight and pest, and later harvested under the hot sun.
Agriculture was both the foundation and the struggle defining most peasant lives. The growing seasons governed every aspect of the year. In spring, villagers turned soil and planted seed. The long summer brought weeding and vigilance. Harvest came in frantic bursts before the first frost. Winter meant tending animals, preserving food, mending tools, and surviving bite and cold. Women's work was no less demanding. They ran the household's prosaic engine, cooking over smoky fires, spinning wool and flax into thread, weaving cloth on simple looms, milking cows and goats, washing dirtied linens by hand, tending small vegetable gardens, raising children, and mending clothes and tools. Their work balanced the household economy in a rhythm parallel and intertwined with the fields. Children learned early that play was scarce and life required contribution. From toddlers gathering kindling to teens helping herd animals or carry water, apprenticeship to village labor began in the cradle. Yet within these duties, moments of lightness sprouted. Childhood games, songs, and stories shared around fires that kept the long night at bay. Communal life was vital. Villagers shared resources such as mills and bakehouses, cooperated on large-scale tasks like haymaking and fence repair, and together navigated the precarious specter of bad harvests, illness, or legal disputes. The church acted as both spiritual and social center, offering sanctuary, education, rites of passage, and governance. The manor lord and his officers claimed a large portion of the village's labor and produce as dues. This system bound peasants in a web of obligations, but also secured for them land to farm, protection, and a place in the fragile medieval social order. Despite enduring poverty, malnutrition, and disease, the medieval villagers cultivated networks of mutual aid, celebration, and faith that gave their lives meaning beyond survival. The village, humble and worn, was a forge where centuries of human endurance, hope, and community shaped the landscape and legacy of the Middle Ages. This section richly explores daily life routines, social practices, and the environment of a medieval village in narrative form based on historical sources. As the sun sets beyond the quiet fields, casting long shadows over the thatched roofs and narrow lanes, the medieval village rests, breathing softly in the cool evening air. The echoes of a day's labor fade into murmured prayers and whispered stories shared beside hearth fires, where flames dance beside families bound by blood, faith, and shared survival. This village, like so many others across medieval England and Europe, was the forge of human endurance. It was a world shaped by soil and season, by lord and law, but also by laughter, song, and the unyielding hope knit tightly in community ties.
Through harsh winters, lean harvests, and the heavy demands of servitude, villagers forged lives of profound resilience. Their daily struggles were the unseen canvas upon which the grand sweep of history unfolded. Lives filled with birth, work, love, celebration, and loss. Though the ages have passed and kingdoms risen and fallen, the memory of those generations lingers still. Their essence